At the family reunion, my cousin rolled her eyes. "Oh look, he showed up. Must be out of money again." My uncle snorted. "He's still living in that crappy apartment." My dad just sipped his wine and said, "If you tried harder, maybe you'd have something to brag about too." I just smiled, waited until everyone had a plate of food, then walked over to the event coordinator and said, "You can cancel the payment. They'll be covering it themselves now." I, 32M, stood in the corner of the country club ballroom, nursing a glass of water while my family laughed and mingled around tables draped in white linen. The reunion was in full swing, and I'd been there for maybe 20 minutes before it started. My cousin spotted me first. She was holding court near the appetizer table, her designer dress probably worth more than my monthly rent. Her eyes swept over my department store button-down and clearance rack slacks, and I watched her lips curl. She turned to her husband and said something that made him smirk. Then, loud enough for half the room to hear, she announced that, "Oh look, I'd actually shown up. Must be out of money again." A few people chuckled. I kept my face neutral. My uncle joined in next, his voice booming across the space as he told anyone who'd listened that I was still living in that crappy apartment downtown. He said it like it was a disease, like my zip code was something that might be contagious. His wife nodded along, her expression a mixture of pity and disgust. I could have left then. Should have, probably. But I'd driven 3 hours to be there, and something kept my feet planted on that polished hardwood floor. My father was the one who really twisted the knife. He'd been watching the whole thing from his seat at the head table, swirling his wine like he was at some kind of tasting event. When he finally spoke, his voice carried that particular tone of disappointment I'd been hearing my entire life. He suggested that if I tried harder, maybe I'd have something to brag about too. He said it casually, like he was commenting on the weather, then took another sip of his Cabernet. The room got quiet for a moment. A few people looked away, suddenly very interested in their phones or the centerpieces. But most of them were watching me, waiting to see how I'd react, waiting for me to shrink away like I always had. I smiled instead, not a bitter smile or a fake one, a genuine, calm smile that seemed to confuse them more than anything else could have. I told them all I was glad they were enjoying themselves, that the venue was beautiful, that I hoped everyone was hungry. Then I walked over to the buffet line and grabbed a plate, loading it up with shrimp and prime rib and roasted vegetables that probably cost more per pound than I used to spend on groceries in a week. They went back to their conversations, satisfied that they'd put me in my place. My cousin was already taking selfies with her sister. My uncle was telling some story about his latest boat purchase. My father had moved on to discussing politics with his brother. I ate slowly, watching them all settle in, watching them get comfortable. The thing about my family is that they'd stopped asking questions about my life years ago. After I dropped out of the prestigious university my father had paid for, after I took that job in tech support that made my mother cry, after I moved into that crappy apartment my uncle loved to mention, they'd just written me off. I was the failure, the cautionary tale, the one who'd wasted his potential. They didn't know I'd been learning to code in that apartment, teaching myself programming languages at night after my support shifts ended. They didn't know about the app I'd built, or the small startup that had acquired it, or the stock options that had come with that deal. They definitely didn't know about the second company I'd founded 2 years later, or the Series B funding we'd just closed. I'd kept it all quiet, not out of modesty, but because I'd learned something important over the years. Information was power, and my family weaponized everything they knew. When my father called 6 months ago to announce the reunion, he'd mentioned that he was handling all the arrangements. The whole family would be there, he said. It was important that I attend. And then, almost as an afterthought, he told me not to worry about the cost. He knew things were tight for me. I'd let him think that. I'd let them all think that. But what my father didn't know was that I'd called the country club the next day. I'd spoken with their events coordinator, a pleasant woman who'd been very accommodating when I explained that I wanted to cover the costs for the reunion. All of it. The venue, the food, the bar, everything. I told her not to mention it to anyone, that I wanted it to be a surprise. She'd been delighted by the gesture, probably thinking I was planning some heartwarming reveal. The price tag had been substantial. The country club didn't do anything halfway, and my father had certainly ordered like someone who expected his successful lawyer brother to foot part of the bill. But I'd paid the deposit without flinching, and I'd made sure the coordinator had my number for any questions. Now, Watching my cousin pose for another photo and my uncle slap my father on the back while they shared some joke probably at my expense, I pulled out my phone. I found the coordinator's contact and typed out a quick message asking her to meet me near the entrance. She appeared a few minutes later, slightly flustered and apologetic for taking so long. She asked if everything was all right, if there was a problem with the service. I told her everything was perfect. The food was excellent, the staff was wonderful, everyone was having a great time. She looked relieved. Then I explained that there'd been a change of plans regarding payment. Her smile faltered slightly. She asked what kind of change. I explained that I needed to cancel my payment authorization. I told her that my family would be covering the costs themselves, that she should present the final bill to my father, the gentleman in the navy blazer at the head table, when the event concluded. I apologized for any confusion and assured her that he was expecting it. The coordinator's eyes went wide. She stammered something about the deposit, about the arrangements that had been made weeks ago. I told her I understood, that I was sorry for the inconvenience, but that family circumstances had changed. I kept my voice friendly, sympathetic even. I explained that my father had always been very clear about wanting to host this event properly, and that he'd be disappointed if he didn't get the chance to demonstrate his generosity to the whole family. She looked uncertain, but she was a professional. She asked if I was sure. I told her I'd never been more certain of anything in my life. She nodded slowly, still processing. She said she'd need to verify some things with her manager, but that they'd handle it. She asked when I wanted them to present the bill. I suggested they wait until after dessert was served, when everyone was full and content. I wanted my family to have every bit of enjoyment they could from this evening. She agreed and hurried off, probably to have a mild panic attack with her management team. I went back to my table and finished my meal. The prime rib was cooked perfectly. My younger brother showed up about an hour into the event, late as always. He found me and immediately started apologizing for not defending me earlier. He'd heard about the comments while he was parking. I told him not to worry about it, that it was just the usual family dynamics. He looked uncomfortable, like he wanted to say more, but our aunt called him over and the moment passed. My brother was the only one who'd stayed in touch over the years. He knew bits and pieces about my success, though not the full extent. He'd asked once why I didn't tell everyone, why I let them think I was struggling. I told him I was waiting for the right moment. This was the right moment. Dessert was an elaborate affair, some kind of chocolate tower with fresh berries and gold leaf, because my father never did anything halfway when he was trying to impress people. Everyone cooed over it, took pictures, posted on social media about what a wonderful event it was. My cousin made a point of coming over to my table after she'd finished her dessert. She asked if I'd enjoyed the food, her tone suggesting she thought it was probably the best meal I'd had in months. I told her it was incredible, that the country club really knew how to put on an event. She agreed, then added that it was a shame these things were so expensive. She couldn't imagine how most people could afford it. I just smiled and said that sometimes the things that seemed most expensive were actually priceless. She gave me a confused look and walked away. The coordinator appeared near the entrance about 20 minutes later. She was holding a leather folio, the kind fancy restaurants used to present checks, and she looked like she was steeling herself for something unpleasant. She scanned the room until she spotted my father, then made her way over to his table. I watched from across the room as she approached him, leaning down to speak quietly. I watched my father's expression shift from jovial to confused to concerned. He opened the folio she'd handed him, and I could see the exact moment he processed what he was looking at. His face went red, then pale, then red again. My uncle noticed his brother's distress and leaned over to look at the bill. His reaction was almost identical. Both men started speaking rapidly to the coordinator, their voices rising slightly. A few people at nearby tables began to notice the commotion. The coordinator was shaking her head, gesturing apologetically. I couldn't hear what she was saying, but I knew the gist. The person who'd arranged to cover the costs had withdrawn their payment, and per the contract signed when the venue was booked, the financial responsibility fell to the person who'd made the reservation. My father. My aunt joined the conversation, then my cousin's husband, then suddenly half the table was involved. The coordinator looked increasingly stressed, and I almost felt bad for her. Almost. My father stood up abruptly, the kind of movement that makes everyone in a room stop and look. He was scanning the crowd, and I knew exactly who he was looking for. When his eyes landed on me, the expression on his face was something I'd never seen before. fury mixed with humiliation, mixed with dawning comprehension. He started walking toward me, and the room went silent. Even the staff seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere. When he reached my table, he demanded to know what I'd done. His voice was shaking, whether from anger or shock I couldn't tell. I set down my coffee cup and looked up at him calmly. I asked what he meant. He told me the coordinator had said I was the one who'd arranged payment initially, that I'd canceled it just now. He wanted to know if this was some kind of joke, some kind of sick game. I explained that I'd originally planned to cover the reunion as a gift. I wanted to do something nice for the family, to show my appreciation for everyone gathering together. But then I'd realized something during dinner. I'd realized that my father was right. If I tried harder, maybe I would have something to brag about. And the thing was, I didn't have anything to brag about. I was just a guy living in a crappy apartment, barely scraping by, right? So it seemed inappropriate for someone like me to be covering such an expensive event. It made much more sense for him to handle it, since he was the successful one, since he had so much to be proud of. My father's jaw worked soundlessly for a moment. Around us, I could see my family members starting to understand what had happened, starting to do the mental math on what a country club event for 40 people might cost. My uncle pushed his way forward, demanding to know what the bill was. My father showed him the folio, and my uncle actually staggered backward a step. He asked if that was the real number, if there'd been some kind of mistake. The coordinator, who'd followed my father across the room, assured everyone that the bill was correct. She listed the charges: venue rental, full bar service, premium menu selection, dessert, service fees, gratuities. It was all itemized very clearly. My cousin appeared at her father's elbow, looking at the bill over his shoulder. She made a choking sound. She turned to me and asked why I would do this, what was wrong with me. I told her I wasn't doing anything. I was just a broke relative living in a crappy apartment, remember? I had no business paying for events like this. I was simply correcting an oversight, making sure the financial responsibility landed where it belonged, with the people who actually had something to brag about. My father found his voice again. He said I was being petty, that I was embarrassing the family, that he'd never expected this kind of behavior from me. I stood up slowly, taking my time. I told him he was absolutely right. He'd never expected anything from me. Not success, not achievement, not even basic human dignity. For years, I'd been the punchline to their jokes, the example of what not to become, the failure they could all feel superior to. And I'd let them believe it because, frankly, their opinions had stopped mattering to me a long time ago. The room was dead silent now. Even the staff had stopped clearing plates. I continued, my voice steady and calm. I explained that I'd spent the last several years building a company. I'd worked 18-hour days in that crappy apartment they all loved to mock. I'd eaten ramen and ignored phone calls and learned everything I could about an industry they knew nothing about. And somewhere along the way, that company had become successful. Very successful. Successful enough that I could have paid for this event 100 times over without noticing the dent in my bank account. My cousin tried to interrupt, saying this was insane, that I was lying. I pulled out my phone and opened my email, showing her the most recent investor update from my company. She stared at the numbers like they were written in a foreign language. I asked if she wanted to see the stock portfolio too, or maybe the closing documents from our Series B funding round. I had plenty of documentation if she needed proof. She stepped back, her face pale. I turned back to my father. I told him the worst part wasn't the insults or the condescension or the decades of disappointment. The worst part was that he'd never once asked. Not in 5 years had he or anyone else in this room bothered to ask how I was actually doing, what I was actually working on, whether I was happy or fulfilled or proud of myself. They'd just assumed, and they'd been content with their assumptions because it made them feel better about their own lives. My father started to say something, but I held up a hand. I told him I'd originally planned to reveal everything tonight, to pay for the whole event, and then announce my success during the toasts. I'd imagined it would feel good, watching their faces change, finally getting the recognition I'd been denied. But standing there in the corner earlier, listening to them mock me while they ate food I'd paid for, I'd realized something important. I didn't want their recognition anymore. I didn't need it. The only thing I needed was for them to understand exactly what they'd lost by treating me the way they had. I gestured around the room, at the half-eaten desserts and empty wine glasses and elegant decorations. I told them to enjoy the rest of their evening, that the country club would work out payment arrangements with whoever was covering the bill. Then I told them I wouldn't be attending any future family events, that they'd have plenty of time to brag to each other without my presence bringing down the mood. My brother stood up from his table, calling my name. He looked stricken. I told him softly that he was always welcome in my life. He knew where to find me. But as for the rest of them, I was done. I walked toward the exit, and nobody tried to stop me. The coordinator looked relieved that I was leaving, probably hoping my departure would somehow defuse the situation. As I passed the head table, I heard my aunt asking my father how much the bill was, her voice shrill with panic. I heard him tell her the number, and I heard the collective gasp that followed. I didn't look back. Update 1. I drove home that night in silence. No music, no phone calls, just the sound of the road and my own thoughts. My hands shook slightly on the steering wheel, the adrenaline finally catching up with me. What I'd done was irreversible, nuclear even, and part of me couldn't quite believe I'd actually gone through with it. My phone started ringing before I even got back to my apartment. My father, my uncle, my cousin, various other relatives. The calls came in waves. I declined them all. Then the texts started, ranging from apologetic to furious to confused. I turned on Do Not Disturb and threw the phone on the passenger seat. When I got home to my crappy apartment, the one bedroom with the weird kitchen layout and the view of the parking lot, I sat on my secondhand couch and felt nothing but relief. The space was small and imperfect, but I'd written my first successful code sitting at that kitchen table. I'd taken the investor calls that changed my life standing on that narrow balcony. The apartment wasn't a symbol of failure. It was the foundation of everything I'd built. My brother showed up around midnight. He'd texted first, asking if I was okay, if he could come by. He was the only one I'd responded to. When I opened the door, he just looked at me for a long moment, then asked what the hell had just happened. I invited him in and made coffee, and then I told him everything. The full story of the last 5 years, the company, the acquisition, the funding rounds, the current valuation. His eyes got wider with every detail. When I finished, he sat back and asked why I'd never said anything. I explained what I'd told the family earlier, that they'd never asked, and I'd stopped wanting to tell them. But also, I admitted, part of me had been waiting to see how long it would take for them to notice. How long I could be successful before someone in the family bothered to look past their assumptions. He asked how long the answer turned out to be. I told him 5 years and counting. They never would have known if I hadn't forced the issue tonight. My brother ran his hands through his hair, processing. He told me the country club scene had been absolute chaos after I left. My father and uncle had tried to negotiate with the coordinator, arguing that there'd been a misunderstanding, but the contract was ironclad. They'd eventually agreed to split the bill, but it had wiped out a significant portion of my father's savings. My cousin's husband had offered to contribute, probably trying to smooth things over, but the damage was done. He said our aunt had cried, several relatives had left early, and everyone was texting everyone else trying to figure out what to do. Some people were angry with me, calling what I did cruel and vindictive. Others were angry with my father and uncle, saying they'd brought it on themselves. The family group chat was a disaster. I asked if he thought I'd gone too far. He was quiet for a long moment, then said he didn't know. What they'd done was wrong. The way they'd treated me was wrong, but the financial hit was severe. My father wasn't destitute, but he wasn't wealthy enough to brush off that kind of expense easily. I nodded, accepting his honesty. I told him I'd thought about that, about the money. But the truth was, the bill wouldn't ruin my father's life. It would hurt, it would be inconvenient, but he'd recover. What it would do was make him remember, every time he saw the credit card statement, every time he had to adjust his budget. It would make all of them remember that actions have consequences, that you can't treat people like garbage and expect them to keep accepting it. My brother asked what I was going to do now. I told him I was going to keep living my life. I'd built something I was proud of, surrounded myself with people who actually valued me, and I wasn't going to let family drama pull me back into that toxic dynamic. He'd always be welcome in my world, but everyone else had made their choices. He left around 2 in the morning, hugging me at the door and promising to stay in touch. I believed him. Update 2. 3 weeks after the reunion, my father showed up at my office unannounced. My assistant called me in a panic, saying there was someone demanding to see me, claiming to be family. I told her to send him up. He looked older than I remembered, or maybe I'd just never noticed before. He sat across from my desk, glass and steel, very different from the country club's traditional elegance, and stared at the view of the city skyline behind me. He told me he'd paid the bill in full, didn't split it with my uncle like my brother had mentioned, decided he needed to take responsibility for his own mistakes. It had depleted most of his liquid savings, and he'd had to delay some renovations on his house, but it was done. I thanked him for letting me know. He asked if I was satisfied now, if I'd gotten what I wanted. I leaned back in my chair and told him I didn't want anything from him. Not anymore. What happened at the reunion wasn't about revenge or satisfaction. It was about setting a boundary. For years, I'd accepted their treatment because I didn't have the confidence or resources to push back. But I wasn't that person anymore, and I needed them to understand that. My father's expression shifted, something like regret crossing his face. He said he'd been thinking about what I'd said that night, about how they'd never asked about my life. He admitted that I was right. He'd been so disappointed when I dropped out of school, so frustrated by what he saw as wasted potential, that he'd stopped looking at who I actually was. He'd made assumptions and stuck with them because it was easier than admitting he might have been wrong. I appreciated the honesty, I told him, but it didn't change anything. An apology after the damage was done, after he'd been forced to face consequences, wasn't the same as genuine change. He asked what it would take for me to consider reconciling with the family. I told him I didn't know if that was possible. Trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt with a single conversation or a forced apology. If he wanted a relationship with me, it would have to be built from scratch, with no assumptions, no expectations, and no more comparisons or judgments. And it would take time. Years, maybe. He asked if I'd be willing to try. I looked at him for a long moment. This man who'd shaped so much of my early life, whose approval I'd once craved desperately. I told him I'd think about it, but I couldn't promise anything. And in the meantime, he needed to understand that my life wasn't going to revolve around family dynamics anymore. I had a company to run, people who depended on me, goals that had nothing to do with proving anything to anyone. He nodded slowly and stood to leave. At the door, he turned back and said he was proud of what I'd built, even if he'd never said it before. I told him I knew. That was part of the problem. After he left, I sat in my office for a long time, watching the city lights flicker on as evening fell. My assistant buzzed to ask if I needed anything, but I told her I was fine. And the strange thing was, I actually meant it. For the first time in as long as I could remember, I felt completely, genuinely fine. The weight of their expectations, their disappointment, their judgment, it was gone. I'd cut it loose at that country club, left it sitting at those white linen tables along with the empty plates and wine glasses. My brother texted me that night, asking how the meeting with our father had gone. I told him it was civil, that we'd talked, that maybe someday there'd be a path forward. But I wasn't holding my breath, and I wasn't rearranging my life to make it happen. He sent back a simple message saying he understood and that he was grabbing dinner near my apartment next week if I wanted to join. I told him I'd be there. Some family is worth keeping, worth fighting for, worth rebuilding with. But some bridges need to burn completely before you can see clearly enough to build something better. That reunion, that bill, that moment of walking out while they all watched in stunned silence. It wasn't about cruelty or revenge. It was about finally, definitively, choosing myself. And in my crappy apartment that night, surrounded by the life I'd built on my own terms, I didn't regret a single thing.